This episode contains depictions of police violence, explosions, and injuries. There's also some medical content. Please take care as you listen.
Qui je suis Nathalie Duval.
In 2018, Nathalie Duval was living in a small town near the Loire Valley in central France. It's known for its rich history and landscape, its picturesque vineyards and castles. Nathalie and her town are working class. She's a mother of 5 and a grandmother, and at the time, she was working a temp job at the post office sorting the mail. Things were always tight. She never seemed to have enough money to take care of everyone.
Ma vie ressemblait...
My life was like that of everyone, right?
This is Nathalie, speaking through a voice actor.
Un peuple lambda, tout simplement. Je travaille.
Like the average person, I simply work and raise my kids. At the end of the day, you just have to work, consume, and shut your mouth.
The working class is always struggling, but this particular moment was especially hard. French President Emmanuel Macron was newly elected at the time, and while so many people were struggling to make ends meet, he told people that it was their fault they couldn't make it work, that if someone really wanted to find a job, all they had to do was cross the street and go look for one, and that he could find one in a heartbeat. At the same time, the price of everything was going up. Food, clothes, and gas, which Nathalie needed to get to work every day. It was more than living paycheck to paycheck. It was shift to shift. She could only afford to get 10 or 20 euros worth of gas or petrol at a time. So when Nathalie heard that there was going to be a new tax on fuel, she was furious. She was worried about climate change, but she also wanted to be able to pay her bills. So she decided to go to a protest in her town.
J'allais dans des manifs, mais voilà.
I was going to protest, but they weren't protests that really affected me. So that time when I went out, yes, it was for the petrol because it affected everyone. It wasn't 3 or 4 people out. It was thousands. That's what was beautiful.
Et c'est ça qui était beau.
Nathalie was going with her son, Michael, who is in his 30s and also had a temp job as a postal worker. Together, they'd suit up in these bright yellow vests and head to the streets, where they'd meet up with a sea of protesters, all wearing bright yellow vests. They're the kind you might see construction workers wearing. In France, everyone has to keep one in their car. If they break down, or if they have some kind of emergency, they put it on. And in a symbolic sign of collective distress, the yellow vest has become the distinctive uniform for this ragtag group of protesters. In fact, they're simply known as the yellow vests, les gilets jaunes.
Les gilets jaunes.
As yellow vests, we were fighting for petrol because without petrol, you can't go to work. And without work, you don't have money. Without money, how do you provide for the kids? How do you pay your bills?
The Yellow Vest protests started as a reaction to a rise in fuel prices. So at the beginning, they were supported by notorious climate deniers like Donald Trump. And they got a reputation for being opposed to climate action. But in fact, most of the Yellow Vests actually wanted better climate policies. They just didn't want to do it at the expense of the working class. And quickly, their demands came to be about much more. Social justice, taxing the rich, environmental policies that don't leave workers behind, and, ultimately, getting the president to resign. The movement is made up of mostly working-class people who live away from large urban centers, people who bear the brunt of the cost of living crisis and rely heavily on their cars. So, they protest by occupying roundabouts. There, you can see people from all over the political spectrum, far right, far left, and people who refuse to vote at all. And a lot of these protesters were women like Nathalie. At first, when Nathalie and Michael went to all of these demonstrations for higher wages, against pension reform, for workers' rights, they expected pushback from the police. That's because they were seeing so many officers in riot gear deployed for the protests. They'd brought single doses of saline solution in their bags to wash tear gas away from their eyes, just in case. Instead, the police seemed indifferent, even benevolent at times. It almost seemed like they were on the side of the protesters.
C'est que j'avais été à une manif à Paris. Je ne sais plus laquelle que c'est. Et sur une manif à Paris,
I went to a protest in Paris. I can't remember which one anymore. At this protest in Paris, on one side, you had all of the riot police, and they had taken off their helmet. They were just smiling at us. They weren't doing anything. They weren't moving. They were just watching us.
ils avaient leur bouclier à la main, leur casque dans les mains, tout.
They had their shield in one hand, their helmet in another. I said, well done to you for once. That was nice. We thought, maybe they are not all the same.
Ils avaient enlevé leur casque. They had taken off their helmets as if to say, you don't have to be scared of us?
C'est ça.
Yes, exactly.
Over the next few months, the protests kept getting bigger, until eventually it wasn't just thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people descending on the streets every weekend. And the police were not as supportive as that first experience Nathalie described, at all. The French police were systematically using force and illegally corralling protesters. Dozens of people were blinded by rubber bullets, and at least 5 had their hands ripped off by tear gas grenades. But this didn't deter Michael and Nathalie. Over the years, the protests became a way of life for Michael and Nathalie. They made lots of friends in the Yellow Vests. By March of 2023, they'd been to dozens of these demonstrations. So when they found out about one against the privatization of water in this small town called Sainte-Soline, it made sense that they'd go. Michael got out of his night shift, he took a power nap, and then a friend picked him up to go meet the rest of their group. Nathalie had her own late shift the night before, and she was exhausted. So before Michael walked out the door, she said the thing that any parent would say to their kid.
Fais attention.
Be careful. Michael and his friends drove 2 hours to Sainte-Soline. When they got there, the police stopped them and checked their car. Then they let them through to this big open field where the protest was taking place. At home, Nathalie was easing into her morning after her long night shift. She was drinking her cappuccino and had the TV on in the background. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something unsettling. Clashes between the police and protesters. There was tear gas and people in gas masks and smoke billowing from torched police cars. She tried calling Michael, but he didn't answer, which isn't that unusual for him.
Michael et son téléphone, c'est tout un art.
Michael and his phone, it's a whole thing. He always loses one every time he goes to a protest.
Eventually, she managed to get through to one of his friends. When she talked to Michael, he said they'd just parked the car. They could see the protesters in the distance, but they were still far from the reservoirs. They decided to go in anyway. From where they stood, it didn't look that bad, and they had come all this way. So Nathalie told him again, just in case.
Tu fais attention, elle me fait, mais je fais attention, maman, promis. Ok, d'accord.
I said, be careful. He said, yes, Mom, I promise. I'll be careful. I said, okay, fine.
Michael and his friends start walking towards the crowd. It's a big field and there are cars parked all around them. New groups of demonstrators are still arriving from all sides in their rain boots. They can see different convoys making their way to the reservoir, and they decide to follow one of them. And then, as they get closer, they start seeing what Nathalie just saw. Around 1 p.m., a national news network announced that 2 protesters were in critical condition. Nathalie immediately thought of Michael, and under her breath, she started repeating to herself like a slow, soft prayer.
Pourvu qu'il n'y a pas mon fils, pourvu qu'il n'y a pas mon fils, pourvu qu'il n'y a pas mon fils.
Please let it not be my son. Let it not be Michael. I'm Anna Pujol-Mazzini, and this is Drilled, the real free speech threat. France prides itself on being a country of protest. After all, that's how we got rid of the monarchy and why we have workers' rights. And it wasn't always peaceful. But over the years, protest has gotten more dangerous, and the government started using anti-terror laws to target climate activists. Then, everything came to a head over one bloody weekend in March of 2023. That story after the break.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
It's Wednesday, Addams. I see you're trying to distract yourself from your own banal thoughts. Let me help. Here's a recording thing made of my latest root canal.
Wednesday, Season 2, begins August 6th, only on Netflix.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
At the same time that Natalie and Michael and the Yellow Vests were taking to the streets, there was another movement rising up in Europe. One that was staging dramatic climate protests in London, blocking bridges, jumping onto trains during rush hour, and gluing themselves to the gates of Buckingham Palace, all in an attempt to force the government to take action on climate policy. Their name?
Extinction Rebellion.
Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion.
While the Yellow Vests were mostly working-class people from rural areas, Extinction Rebellion was largely middle-class, college-educated activists in cities, people who could get away with taking big risks. This is Alice. Well, I'm going to call her Alice, for her own protection. Alice spent her childhood moving around, mostly in France. But wherever they settled, Alice and her family would take long nature walks, trying to guess the names of the birds or taking pictures of the landscape. Now she's in her mid-30s, she's an engineer with a master's degree, and she's been a climate activist for much of her life. She spent years signing petitions, handing out flyers, going to protests and volunteering abroad. But she got frustrated. The climate crisis was looming, and she felt like she was doing too little, that things weren't moving fast enough. So in late 2018, when she heard about Extinction Rebellion, she decided she wanted to bring their tactics to France. And she wasn't alone. With about 100 other people, she started a chapter in Paris. And pretty soon,
we started occupying for more than a week one of the sort of central public square in Paris. And it just happened really smoothly.
And the authorities weren't sure how to respond. They'd basically never seen this sort of protest before, one that was so big and flashy and so ripe for media coverage.
And what we knew at the time is that there was a conflict between the mayor of Paris, the socialist mayor of Paris, and then the head of the police department in Paris, and where the mayor wasn't going to actively say that she was against climate militants and a climate movement. So that was kind of the first time where you could really feel that there was going to be a fracture between police and then a mayor or a president or a prime minister.
The movement grew quickly to dozens of local chapters with thousands of members. They weren't just in Paris, but also in smaller cities like Strasbourg and Bordeaux and Annecy. And lots of people were taking notice. including the police.
The more occupation and actions, the more we were also infiltrated by surveillance.
Just 2 years later, Extinction Rebellion and Yellow Vest activists like Michael were showing up together, marching side by side at Sainte-Soline. Which might sound really surprising to anyone who knows anything about the climate movement. That unity didn't just happen. In January 2021, hundreds of people came together. There were old anti-nuclear activists, some farmers' unions, and younger activists from Extinction Rebellion and the like. They gathered in a makeshift community hall in a wetland area called Notre-Dame-des-Landes to create a new, more integrated movement. Notre-Dame-des-Landes is a historic place for climate activism. In the 2000s, hundreds of people moved to the area to try and stop the construction of a new airport. They built an entire town made out of wood, complete with houses, a bakery, and shops, and they lived there. It became a sort of social experiment. They called it a ZAD, Zone à défendre, a zone to defend. And since then, dozens have sprouted across France. The government is so concerned that it put together a special unit to prevent their expansion. It's a team of legal experts that helps local officials dismantle these zones as soon as they pop up. And in this place, all these activists from very different movements, some of which had historically clashed over class and ideological differences, they decided to create a coalition of grassroots groups from all across the country under one banner, Les Soulèvements de la Terre, the Earth Uprisings. Their slogan, "We are the Earth defending itself." In their founding text, one of the things they emphasized was that they want to get rid of the class divide that has plagued the climate movement. Not just in France, but all over the world. They wrote, "We do not believe in two-tiered climate activism in which a minority prides itself on eating organic and driving a hybrid SUV, while the majority is stuck in jobs they don't want to do, long daily commutes, and low-cost food." Their goals were to take back the land from polluting industries, occupy and disarm ecocidal projects, and bring everyone together. The farmers, the unions, the urban social justice organizers, the anarchist groups, and the people fighting against projects in their own backyards. They decided to focus on one issue in particular, water, which is how we end up with Michael heading to the Sainte-Soline protest in 2023. Across France, there are these things called mega basins being built. They're huge reservoirs that capture and store groundwater in the winter so that farmers can irrigate their fields during summer droughts. Thanks in part to climate change, France has just been through back-to-back droughts, including our first ever winter drought last year. The problem is, pumping water from underground actually makes droughts worse. And the reservoirs can only be used by a handful of large agribusinesses, which are mainly focused on cornfields and other irrigation plants for export. Activists say the mega basins are effectively privatizing water and putting small, more sustainable farmers out of business.
So the sort of movement against these had been growing over the months. And I guess it became a real realization for a lot of people what the fight for water meant and access to water. And so I think that kind of resonated for a lot of people. And it meant that a lot of people came from all over France.
The first big protest was organized at the site of one of the basins in October 2022 in Sainte-Soline, just 5 months before Michael went there with his friends. It's a small village in western France of about 600 people. Thousands showed up, and the government was not happy.
Des modes opératoires qui relèvent, je n'ai pas peur de le dire, de l'écoterrorisme que nous devons absolument combattre.
That's French Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin. He said the protesters used methods which, I'm not afraid to say it, amount to eco-terrorism, which we absolutely must fight. It was really unusual to hear a French government official use the word terrorism to talk about climate activists.
And so the more the actions went on over the months, the more people would actually come. And because it's over a weekend, it means that a lot of people can travel to spend a few days there.
Months later, activists reconvened in Sainte-Soline. People gathered in the fields on Friday night for discussions, shared meals, an evening of fun before the big day. Hundreds of brightly colored tents popped up around the activists' camp.
You had a lot of families and of people coming from all over France, farmers' unions, political movements, a lot of people who were not essentially in climate movements, but heard of what was going on, and so would come there also as their first big action or, actions. So it was like the diversity of people. I've never seen that in the actions that we've had in Extinction Rebellion, for example.
The next morning, thousands started marching to one of the basins. Their goal was to stop construction, take apart some of the pipes that had already been installed, and get a moratorium on any new reservoirs being built with public funds. There was even a community radio station that was created specifically for the event.
Belle comme une pioche qui déterre les tuyaux des méga-bassines, c'est Méga Radio, la radio éphémère et vénère des luttes du Marais Poitevin.
The protesters divided into 3 groups marching separately. A blue one, a yellow one, and a pink one. Each block had a mascot representing a local species that's threatened with extinction. For the blues, an eel. For the yellows, an otter. And the pinks hold up a type of bird called a bustard.
The group that I was in, we had a massive bird that was built out of wood that like dozens of people were carrying. You had kids, people playing music.
The activists walked for miles before they reached the basin, a huge unfinished reservoir that basically looks like an empty hole.
And we arrived around the basin and everybody was holding hands. And the idea was to literally circle around the basin holding hands, and that was it.
But that's not what happened.
You had police that kind of started to arrive from everywhere, and without even being a threat, by simply walking in a field, you started to have police shooting tear gas and grenades.
She means a kind of less lethal grenade, one that releases pepper spray or tear gas, and usually some kind of rubber pellets.
And that kind of started a bit. And then within, I'd say, a few minutes, that became complete chaos. They literally didn't stop for 2 hours.
Capucine Blouet, a human rights observer who was on the scene, could barely keep track of all the attacks.
There were explosive grenades, crowd dispersal grenades, tear gas grenades, and stun grenades. They are the usual kind of tear gas grenades, but there are also tear gas grenades that are deafening and explosive. And they were launched non-stop, so we were thinking that they were very injuring. It was almost a grenade per second at that time. And almost systematically after we hear an explosion, we heard someone calling for medics.
The worst was that moment where all you could hear was medic, people shouting, asking for help because you had so many people injured. And we were 30,000 people. So it's massive. But you have to imagine that in less than 2 hours, they threw more than 4,000 grenades. So it was a constant flow of grenades being thrown at us, and that noise. Nobody's ever seen that before in their lives, and it just wouldn't stop.
In the middle of this chaos, dozens of protesters are screaming for help. On different sides of the field and at different times, 2 men fell to the ground. They were unconscious and bleeding. One had been hit in the head and one in the windpipe. Volunteer medics bandaged their wounds and wrapped them under survival blankets. And then they frantically sent messages to the other doctors at the protests, begging for help. "He's not breathing," said one message. "It's an absolute critical emergency," said another.
I was with a group of people trying to evacuate people who were massively injured.
Doctors, activists, and even politicians tried to call emergency services. But for hours, no one came. In this recording, obtained by human rights observers, a volunteer doctor says, "Where are you in terms of what to me looks like the biggest absolute medical emergency?" And the emergency responder explains, "We're not going to send a helicopter or an ambulance to the scene because the police gave us orders not to."
The police wouldn't let the ambulances arrive, and actually seeing these people and thinking deep down, this person is not going to live if someone doesn't come now.
Natalie was still at home watching all of this unfold on TV, and she started to panic. She tried calling Michael over and over again, but no one answered. Finally, her phone rang. It was one of Michael's friends. He told her that Michael was one of the 2 people in critical condition. He was the one who had been hit in the windpipe. The last time he saw Michael was lying on the ground, unconscious. Natalie called hospitals in the region, trying to find him. It turned out he'd been taken to Poitiers, almost an hour from Sainte-Soline. She drove straight there.
Ils m'ont laissé rentrer, et quand j'ai vu mon fils...
They let me in, and when I saw my son, I was in tears. All the left side of his face, he looked like Elephant Man.
Il savait pas qu'on était là, mais au départ, il m'a pas reconnu.
He didn't know we were there. At the beginning, he didn't even recognize me. Then when he did, when he heard my voice, he would stay lucid for a fraction of a second. Then he'd be gone again. He'd go back to sleep.
Il disait laissez-moi tranquille, j'ai rien fait. Arrêtez.
He kept saying, "Leave me alone. Stop beating me up."
Il y avait plus rien, quoi.
There was nothing left of him. And I kept saying to him, "You're not leaving me. Michael, you can't. You have a son. You can't abandon us."
The next day, Natalie got a call from the hospital.
J'ai le médecin qui m'appelle et qui me dit...
The doctor called me and he said, "Ma'am, I really need to talk to you about your son." Instantly, I was in tears.
On est obligé d'opérer votre fils en urgence du cerveau.
We have to operate on your son's brain urgently. It's extremely urgent. So he explained he has internal bleeding and we're trying to close up the artery. We will have to put him in an artificial coma.
J'ai téléphoné à ma fille.
I called my daughter to tell her.
Pour lui dire que j'allais peut-être perdre... Excusez-moi.
There was a chance we would lose her brother.
Puis j'allais peut-être perdre son frère. Michael, les derniers mots que...
Michael, the last words he said when he had a moment of lucidity were, "Oh, my mommy, you're here." And then he went straight back into his coma. I kept trying to talk to him. I kept trying to wake him up. I said, "Michael, Michael, Michael." But he was already gone. He was not responding anymore. I told myself, my son is about to die. My son is going to die.
Cela relève de l'écoterrorisme.
For months, media coverage of climate activists had been getting worse. But now, as surgeons were operating on Michael's brain and Natalie was anxiously waiting for news, politicians and commentators went on the offensive, including President Emmanuel Macron.
mais vous avez des milliers de gens qui étaient simplement venus pour faire la guerre.
He said, "You have thousands of people who simply came to wage war." And news outlets said the protesters were violent. They focused on the dozens of police officers the government says were injured, but left out the fact that so were 200 protesters. And 2 of them, including Michael, were fighting for their lives. The Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, said that no weapons of war had been used by police. But human rights observers, activists, and journalists who were at the protest, they all released videos showing that they did. In the midst of all this, public opinion turned against the protesters. So Darmanin took advantage of the moment and announced he would disband the movement.
J'ai donc décidé d'engager la dissolution des soulèvements de la terre.
I have therefore decided to initiate the dissolution of the Earth Uprisings, which I will put to a future Council of Ministers. This was a huge blow to activists, and it was about to get a whole lot worse, because behind the scenes, a powerful lobby was getting involved, one that had the power to definitively tip the scales against the protesters. After the water protest, lobbyists were angry, especially Arnaud Rousseau, the president of one of the largest agriculture interest groups in the country, known as FNSEA. Tens of thousands of people had turned up at Sainte-Soline, and then just a few months later, there were more protests at industrial farms. Politicians and big ag interest groups said the activists were targeting poor, hard-working farmers. In France, where agriculture is such a big part of the economy, this argument really resonated with the public. And Arnaud Rousseau seized on this. He said, "The total impunity of Earth Uprisings will lead everyone to civil war. The FNSEA calls on everyone to be calm and restrained. But I have to add that I'm not sure I will be able to hold my troops for long. An incident can happen." And when someone like him makes a threat, it doesn't go unnoticed. The FNSEA spends 600,000 euros a year on lobbying. They're powerful. Militants affiliated with the group have set town halls on fire and dropped tons of cow dung in front of the Ministry of Agriculture. They've attacked elected officials and threatened climate activists. But to the government, the water protectors are the eco-terrorists. And the union farmers, well, they need to be protected. In 2019, the government even gave them their own police force. Yes, you heard that right. The French government created a special intelligence unit to deal with threats against agriculture interests, what they call agribashing. The force is called the Demeter Unit. It was created in partnership with the FNSEA, that big lobby I mentioned before, and it often targets climate activists. In 2023, days after Rousseau made his threats, the government announced by decree the dissolution of the Earth Uprisings. But Earth Uprisings wasn't an NGO or even an organization, which left people wondering, how do you disband a movement? Can the government even do that? What they could do was arrest activists, and they did. 18 were arrested in connection with alleged violence at the water protest. The government didn't just start these crackdowns overnight. There was a long lead up to their ability to do this, and for the public to tolerate it. 8 years before the Sainte-Soline protests and the dissolution of the Earth Uprisings, in November 2015, French climate activists were preparing for the moment that the whole world would be watching them. COP21 in Paris. For years, COPs seemed to turn into one missed opportunity after the next. This time, they decided it would be different. Activists would put so much pressure on governments that they would have no choice but sign a real agreement, one that would not let global warming reach more than 2 degrees. 2 weeks before presidents and prime ministers from all over the world were supposed to land in Paris.
Police have now confirmed at least 4 attacks in the city of Paris tonight. One at the Stade de France, where there was a major soccer game between France and Germany. The French President, François Hollande, in attendance. The AP reporting there were suicide bombers outside the stadium. You could hear it right there as the game was going on. And the most horrifying attack of all at the Bataclan Concert Hall, where an American heavy metal band was playing tonight. The AP is reporting at least 100 have been found dead inside that concert hall.
Gunmen broke into the Bataclan in the middle of a rock concert and started shooting. They gunned down people having drinks at terraces and even tried to blow up the Stade de France while the president was watching a soccer game. By the end of the night, 130 people were dead. The country was in shock. It was the deadliest terror attack France had ever seen. The president said, "Never again." And in the wake of that, Parliament passed new laws to prevent terrorist activity on French soil. The first law declared a state of emergency.
Protesters were out in the streets despite a state of emergency, banning dozens of demonstrations planned for this week's climate summit, and most of them wouldn't leave.
That state of emergency restricted protests and even put 24 activists on house arrest to stop them from protesting. So that huge climate march planned for COP, it was cancelled. Instead, activists brought 4 tons of shoes to the Place de la République, this huge square in the middle of Paris, to represent all the people who wanted to come out and march.
It all started peacefully, laying shoes to represent the thousands whose marches were cancelled.
They're not interested in having their voices kept out of this climate conference.
This is where the revolution started. This is where the people can express themselves. It's not called the Place de la République for nothing.
And even though it was illegal, a few thousand did still come out. 300 people were arrested.
After the tear gas was thrown, you can see that the crowd is really worked up as some of the protesters are staging a sit-in. Other ones are lying on the ground, one gentleman refusing to move.
From there, Parliament continued to pass laws they said were designed to fight terrorism. Laws that made it easier to ban protests, to disband groups that were seen as a threat to public order, to expand surveillance and search people without warrants, to put people on house arrest even if they hadn't committed a crime. One of the laws passed is known as the anti-separatism law. It requires non-profits to pledge allegiance to the values of the French Republic, or risk losing their funding. It also allows authorities to disband a group if any one of its members is accused of inciting material degradation, meaning destruction of public or private property. And what makes a terrorist is very much up to interpretation. Fatima Wassak is a political analyst, a writer, and a prominent climate activist. She says those laws meant to counter terrorism have been unfairly used against a lot of innocent people, long before they were used to target white climate activists. And that when you look black or Arab, you don't need to be campaigning for the climate to get called a terrorist.
People of color get repressed only for existing, not for their political choices or their activism. That's the big difference. And we consider that violence to be less important politically than the one against climate activists. That's the tragic part.
Unlike in the US and other countries, in France, the government's official stance on systemic racism is that it doesn't exist, to the point that it's even against the law to gather ethnic data. We don't actually know how many people of color live in this country, let alone how many people are killed, attacked, or harassed by the police. Fatima runs a working-class environmentalism center called Verdragon. And when it first opened, threatening posters and leaflets started showing up around the neighborhood. They said that mothers behind the project were planning to separate Muslim kids from the others in a bid to sort of segregate the schools, an Islamist plot.
It's hard to get to a space and to see that people made the trip very early in the morning with their faces covered to put up these posters again and again, to hand out leaflets in the neighborhood, in mailboxes, 3 times, to tell the working class people of our neighborhood not to associate with us.
And very quickly, right-wing media outlets were at her door asking her, "Are you plotting to overthrow democracy and instate Sharia law?"
When people say you're a separatist, how do you prove that you're not? How do you prove that you're not an Islamist? When you drop off your children to school, for example, the teachers and the parents don't say hello to you anymore. To understand what is happening in France, you have to understand that a person like me, who campaigned for years for kids to have a vegetarian option in the school cafeteria and on environmental issues, so on the impact of factory farms, global warming, the issue of animal abuse, public health and the health of children when they overconsume meat, all of these are environmental issues. But someone like me doesn't get called an environmental activist. They get called a separatist or an Islamist.
Fatima didn't get much support from the climate movement either. Even though the work she and others do at Verdragon is rooted in environmentalism, like teaching kids to cook vegetarian meals, selling organic vegetables, and explaining the findings of the IPCC reports to the neighbors, it doesn't get recognized as climate activism.
In France, when activist groups are led by people of color and located in working class areas, they are not labeled as climate activists, even when they do environmental work.
And that has always meant getting threatened or attacked. In June, that reality broke through the consciousness of everyone in France. This is the sound of a police officer shooting a 17-year-old Arab French boy in the suburbs of Paris. His name was Naël Merzouk. Despite not having his license yet, he was driving a friend to school, and moments after police pulled him over for a traffic stop, one of the officers shot Merzouk at point-blank range. He died an hour later. After his death, his mother, Mounia, marched and protested and talked about systemic racism and police violence. All the while, she was still clearly in shock. Fatima says there's a link between police brutality against kids of color, the repression of climate activists, and inaction on climate change.
I often say this as a mother. I don't want my children to die under the weight of 3 cops. That's what happened to Adama Traoré.
Fatima is referring to a 24-year-old black Frenchman who died while in police custody.
I don't want my children to die under the weight of 3 cops. But I also don't want my children to die from the air they breathe. I live in Bagnolet, just across a highway interchange. It's one of the most polluted places in Europe. The issues of environment and police brutality, I deal with them on a daily basis. It's a real fear that I deal with every day for my own children. How do we make sure our children can breathe?
On April 14, 2023, 3 weeks after he was taken to hospital, Michael woke up from his coma. Le premier souvenir que vous avez au moment où vous... What's the first thing you remember when you woke up?
Devant ma maman. J'avais encore une sonde dans
Seeing my mother, I still had a tube in my mouth. I couldn't talk, but I was happy to be awake. I thought I had been in the hospital for a day, and in fact, it had been 2.5 weeks. When I woke up, I wasn't myself. I was lost. I didn't know what day it was. I did not know what happened to me.
Ce qui m'a marqué, en fin de compte, c'est Michael quand il s'est fait.
What struck me was Michael when he woke up. the first words that he said. They removed the tube, the intubation, and he said, "Can you order a kebab for me?" We had a good laugh. I looked at Michael, I said, "But you know you're not allowed to eat kebab, right?"
Et je regarde Michael, je dis, mais tu sais que t'as pas le droit au kebab? Il me dit, bah alors un hamburger.
Then he say, "Okay, then I want a hamburger." I said, "But you're also not allowed to have a hamburger." But he said, "Mom, how long have I been here?" I said, "It's been more than 2 weeks, my darling." He said, "Are you serious? And you stayed with me this whole time?" I said, "Yes, you know that your mom is always going to be there."
When I met with Michael last summer, he couldn't feel his fingers at all. Cigarettes would fall from his hands and he wouldn't even notice. And because his hands were numb, he couldn't go back to his job sorting the mail. Natalie said he was still struggling with short-term memory loss. Things like forgetting appointments repeatedly or not remembering parts of conversations he had the day before. But he still goes out to the streets to protest. There's a fear now that he didn't have before, because he's deeply aware that he could have died, and because he saw the scared look in the eyes of his 11-year-old son.
Des manifs pacifiques, oui.
Peaceful protests, yes, but protests with violence, no. That's it, that's finished. I want to return home in one piece. I do not want to return home damaged or worse, especially since police violence during protests has become so common.
It's been almost a year since the Sainte-Soline protest upended the lives of so many activists. Michael is on track to make a full recovery. He's finally regained enough strength to go back to work at the post office. And he and his mum, Natalie, have gone back to their roundabout to protest with their yellow vest comrades. But the other man who was hit, the one who was hit in the head, wasn't so lucky. He woke up from his coma after several months, but he's still regularly in the hospital. His body no longer functions like it used to, and he can no longer do the things he once did. He now has hearing and visual impairments, frequent pain, chronic fatigue, and paralysis in his face. He has a lot of trouble just moving around on his own. After months of back and forth, in November, France's highest court announced that the government decree to disband the Earth Uprisings was thrown out. It said that although activists engaged in provocative and violent acts against property, its disbanding was not appropriate, necessary, and proportionate to the situation. Their members are now free to protest again, and their membership has skyrocketed. At the same time, water reservoirs are still being built, and France is still not meeting the emissions reduction commitments it made as part of the Paris Agreement. In preparation for the 2024 Olympics, the government has displaced people and destroyed natural habitats and arable land. And another law was passed to prevent climate protesters from disrupting sports events. Yet, people continue to protest, even though they risk so much and so rarely see the results of their labor. Corinne Morel-Darleux is a French eco-socialist activist and writer. In her book, Plutôt couler en beauté que flotter sans grâce, which means better to sink beautifully than to stay afloat without grace, she grapples with trying to find a moral compass in this ongoing environmental collapse. In it, she writes, "I feel compelled to continue, not in the hope of future victories. No, if I stay focused, it is no longer with the goal of winning one day. It is vain to aim to change the world. The only thing we can try to do is protect its beauty as a token of our own humanity before we have ruined everything. If we must continue, it is for that, for the dignity of the present." Drilled is an original Critical Frequency production. This episode was written and reported by me, Anna Pujol-Mazzini. Translations for Natalie were voiced by Audrey Laforce. Translations for Michael were voiced by Mathieu Armiel. Thank you to the SOAS Kylie Band for capturing the crowd playing the victory song Le Pieux at the ZAD in 2018.
Our senior editor for the series is Eileen Brown.
Our executive producer is Amy Westerveld, who also fact-checked this episode.
Sarah Ventry and Martin Zoltz-Ostwick are senior producers.
Martin also did the sound design, scoring, and composed much of our music.
Mixing and mastering by Peter Duff, who also composed some of the music in this episode.
Matt Fleming does our artwork.
James Wheaton is our First Amendment attorney.
You can check out more reporting for this series and corresponding print stories at drilled.media.
There, you can also sign up for our newsletter and for a weekly roundup of the most important climate stories and studies. That's it for this time.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next week.